Welcome to this week's lecture on divorce. When we look at America and divorce, we have to really ask ourselves, do we like or do we not like marriage? Because we have one of the highest marriage rates, but also one of the highest divorce rates, and also one of the highest remarriage rates. Now, what is the divorce rate? Well, that's an interesting question because you commonly hear this whole 50% divorce rate. That's actually based on a myth. That's the myth that in any given year, the number of marriages are twice the number of divorces. But the reality is that people divorcing in any given year are not the same people as those who are marrying. Okay? So even if in a given year the number of marriages are twice the number of divorces, those are not the same people marrying and the same people divorcing. You see how that works? So that stat is virtually useless in trying to understand the divorce rates. The better way is to calculate how many people who have ever been married have subsequently divorced. Okay? So looking at the actual people that get married in a year and whether or not they get divorced later. And when we count it that way, that rate never exceeded 41%. Okay, now that's still a high divorce rate, but it's not the 50% that people toss around all the time. However, it's important to point out that divorce statistics can be very deceptive. Low divorce rates does not necessarily mean happy marriages. You can have people not counted in those divorce rates who are not in happy marriages or who are in marriages where there's been desertion, abandonment, or separation. None of those are counted in that rate. You can have marital disruption from the death of a spouse. That's not calculated in that as well. Okay. But the total rate of marital dissolution has remained steady from about mid-19th century on. Meanwhile, divorce rates themselves have actually decreased in the past 3 decades. If current trends continue, nearly 2/3 of marriages will never involve a divorce. Now, that's really counter to what you hear in popular discourse, right? Because all you ever hear is that 50% of marriages thing. Now, what is the cause for this drop in the rates? Because that's significant that it's dropped. Excuse me, that it's dropped in the past 3 decades. Cause for the drops? Well, people are getting married later. Why is that important? It allows people more time to understand what they want in a partner. And I'm so sorry. My asthma is like, whoa. It allows people more time to understand what they want in a partner and to find a suitable partner for themselves rather than when people marry earlier. They very often don't really understand what they want. They may not necessarily find someone suitable as much as they just partner up with some available partner. I know in my own work, especially my work around infidelity, excuse me, most of the folks in that study had married fairly early and talked about the fact that they now realized, decades into marriage, what they actually wanted out of a partner now that they felt that it was too late because they were already married. Another cause for the drop in divorce rates, birth control. I know that's kind of depressing and cynical, right? We're having fewer kids and that's keeping us married. As much as children do bring joy to our lives, we do know that they have a negative impact in terms of satisfaction within a relationship. And I say that and you're all like, oh, I'm never going to have kids. That's what my daughter says. She says, I think the secret to being married is not having children, which is really depressing because I love children. I have many of them myself, and I really, really love some grandchildren, but none of my kids seem very interested. The rise of so-called love marriages, that's been attributed to the decrease in divorce rates as well. And much of that trend, that decrease in divorce rates over the past 3 decades, much of that trend has to do with changing gender roles. Okay? 2/3 of divorces are actually initiated by women. How about that? What does that tell us, right? A marriage survey of 22,000 men and women, that's a very large sample there, found that people who are engaged and living together before a wedding are about as likely to have marriages lasting 15 years as couples who did not live together before they got married. Okay, let me say that again. So if you're living with someone and you're engaged, okay, so that's the critical piece there. Engaged and living together before you get married. You are just as likely to have a marriage lasting 15 years as couples who hadn't cohabited. And it's just something interesting about marriage research. 15 years is like the magic number. You often see in research that if a couple's been married 15 years, they sort of count them as like, I don't know, they've made it somehow, which is interesting because we're seeing a lot of folks getting divorced much longer after 15 years, but that's just kind of a magic number in the research. So it's a little tidbit of useless knowledge for you there. If you're living together before you get married and you weren't engaged, you're actually a little less likely to survive the 10-year mark. So a little bit of interesting tidbit there. And I want to go back for just a second to that changing gender roles thing. So that decrease in divorce rates over the last 3 decades, and we think a lot of that has to do with changing gender roles. The reason that 2/3 of divorces being initiated by women is so interesting when we look at that is with these changing gender roles, a lot of the reason that women initiate divorces has to do with this gender role stuff, with the fact that women do so much more work in the home and that whole second shift that you're reading about and we've talked about. That stuff has to do with a lot of this divorces being initiated by women. So this changing gender roles has a lot to do with that. Another cause for the drop in divorce rates. More people living together before they get married means more ill-fated relationships end in breakups instead of divorce. So think about it. Previous to people even considering living together, people end up getting married, realize after they're married, oh, this is a huge mistake. We never should have done this. And they end up getting divorced. Well, folks move in together, live together, realize this is not going to work. They break up. That doesn't get counted in divorce rates. Another cause for the drop, the growing acceptance of single parent families has reduced the number of shotgun marriages. A shotgun marriage is an old term for like people having to get married because they're pregnant. That is never the most stable of unions. All right, so let's take a look at who exactly is divorcing. Okay, and we know we have a lot of divorces. Who's doing the divorcing? Variables that affect the rates of divorce include the following things, but it's not limited to this, but it does include these things: race, ethnicity, divorce in the family of origin. In other words, if your parents are divorced, you're more likely to divorce. The timing of the first birth of any children, whether the child is born before marriage, within 7 months of marriage, after 7 months, never. One spouse having generalized anxiety disorder, age at the time of marriage. So you can see that these variables, there's a lot of them because it's not limited to what's on this slide. So what causes divorces or what's correlated with divorces, a lot of that is very individualized. Other factors include life course factors. There's a theory called intergenerational transmission, okay, which is this sort of idea that parental divorce increases a chance of a child's marriage ending in the first years by as much as 70%. So it's this idea that if my parents were divorced and I get married, my chance of my marriage ending within the first 5 years is increased as much as 70%. Okay. And if both myself and my spouse, both of our parents are divorced, that risk is even more increased. Okay. And that effect is going to be the strongest when your parents divorce early in your life, like age 12 or younger. Now, don't let this scare you out of getting married. My parents divorced, I must have been 8 or 9, I guess. And yes, this is my second marriage, but both of them are longer than 5 years. So, these are patterns. Don't think this dooms you or anything like that. Let's take a look at some micro level or interpersonal reasons for divorce. Some of these, you should be surprised by them because I know I've been surprised by some of these. Losing your virginity before you are 18 years old is correlated with um, a greater risk of divorce within the first 10 years of marriage. How crazy is that? The age at which you have your sexual debut has an impact on your likelihood of getting divorced within the first 10 years of marriage. That's wild, right? We typically have a higher divorce rate among religious conservatives. It's not what you would expect, right? We theorize that the reason for that is early marriage and early childbearing. Getting married at an earlier age, having children at an earlier age are correlated with divorce as well. Having unrealistic expectations. And that can work in interesting ways as well. We know that couples who have unrealistic expectations and then have fewer children means having more time to focus on your relationship as a couple, and you can end up being disillusioned. So this is crazy, right? It's like almost everything you do increases your risk for divorce. I know, right? It's crazy. Conflict. Arguments and conflict are the major reasons for divorce for both sexes. I don't think that one's a shocker, but you're kind of sitting here thinking, everyone has conflict. Yes, everyone does. Abuse, domestic violence is a major reason for divorce for 42% of women and 9% of men. And we assume that both those numbers are lower than the actual real number. And infidelity. Actually, cheating is the number one major reason for divorce. Okay. No, not the number one. I shouldn't have said that. Lies. Let me back up. Cheating is a major reason for divorce. It's not the number one. Top reasons are like money, cheating, not in that order. But those are the biggies. Money and cheating are biggies. Other predictors of divorce. Premarital doubts predict divorce rates 4 years later. So that's like people are engaged, they're planning their wedding, someone starts to have doubts, right? Or maybe even like they're about to walk down the aisle and they have doubts. You may even know someone like this. I know people like this, and they tend not to cancel the wedding because, oh my gosh, my parents paid for all this and we have all these people here and how embarrassing, and maybe it's just pre-wedding jitters, and how do I know, and I still love this person, yada yada. As actually a predictor of divorce within 4 years. That's especially true if the doubtful partner was the wife. If the wife is the one who has doubts, that more than doubles the risk, right? Now, one person is not scientific data, but I will say, yes, my previous marriage, I did have doubt. I'd had doubt right up until like the time to walk down the aisle, and I didn't call it off because, gosh, all these people were here, and what would, my mom would have lost her mind, and yeah, but there you go. If I'd known this data, maybe I would have done something differently. I don't know. We'll see. Still would have been embarrassing. Divorce is a process, and the signs of trouble become long before the divorce. So it's interesting, we find out someone's getting divorced and we're like, oh my gosh, I'm so surprised. Or suddenly someone wants a divorce. Like it seems sudden and like it just sort of happened overnight to us, the people taking the news. But in reality, those signs come long before the divorce. Even if one partner is sort of like, I thought everything was fine, there's typically signs there that they just may not realize how serious those signs are. People tend to report trouble long before they actually decide to divorce. So let's look at some of these ins and outs of divorce. It is a rather complicated process. Our culture really lacks useful guidelines for acknowledging problems and ending relationships. Okay. We don't have a lot of models for that sort of thing. We don't really know like what that should look like or how that should go. Our communication system with other people is based on trust. Sometimes when there are problems in a relationship and we can't acknowledge those, or we can't end a relationship that perhaps we should end, we start to cease attentive probing. And our routines just kind of go on. So it's like we come to this place where we're like, well, stuff's wrong. I don't know how to address it. I don't know how to end this. And so we just kind of stop, you know, looking into that kind of stuff or thinking about it or sort of poking at it and trying to improve it. And we just kind of go on with our lives. Um, Often we do this because we just don't know how to tell a partner that we don't want to be with them. Okay. And that's because there's really no way to break up with someone that is kind, good, and easy. Think about folks in your life. You probably have someone in your life who wanted to break up with someone and they were like, well, I don't want to hurt them. And I want to still be friends. And I don't want to, make it harder and all this sort of thing. Right. And they're coming from a good place when they say that. It's not like those people are jerks or idiots or anything like that. It's just that the reality is there is no way to break up with someone that is those things. Okay. If both people were invested, or at least the person being broken up with was invested in the relationship, it's going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be bad. It's going to hurt. Okay. And that makes us uncomfortable. So very often we end up staying in relationships well past our expiration date because we just don't know how to end it. Okay. And that's not me throwing shade. We all do it. We've all done this probably at one point or another. Another problem is if we end a relationship, we have to go public with the ending of the relationship, and there's a social stigma attached when that relationship is being married. Now, that's probably the highest social stigma, but if you're living with someone, there's some stigma attached to that. But sometimes even non-cohabiting romantic relationships, there can be some stigma. Maybe your family really thinks that person is like the one for you. And then you've broken up with them. I know lots of situations like that where students told me, I ended this relationship, and they explain why. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, that seems justified to me. But their family is, years afterwards still kind of, jabbing at them about it. Like, you must really regret doing that. That was the wrong decision. And of course, that's not only hurtful, but then of course makes them second guess themselves. Like, gosh, maybe I really didn't try as hard as I should or whatever. We're an achievement-oriented society, and our relationships are also viewed in terms of success and failure. So there's a pressure to frame a relationship in a manner that justifies the breakup to other people. So you're dating somebody, they cheat on you, you can break up with them. Nobody's going to give you any flack about it. But short of them cheating on you or beating you, it can become difficult for you to justify your breakup to other people, which when we stop and step back from that, that's crazy. Why should you have to justify your relationship to anyone else, right? But that's kind of how we've set up our society. And then, you got people passing judgment and taking sides. So really what we see is this private and intimate sort of thing, like marriage, also belongs to other people. Okay, so think about that for a second. We think about marriage as it's a personal, private decision. It's the most intimate relationship of our lives, but it also has all these other people who feel ownership of that relationship. So if you decide to end it, people want some kind of justification, right? Think about when you've broken up with folks you were just dating and how people responded. Now magnify that with marriage. Because again, if there's no cheating or abuse, people, most people are going to be like, you should have hung in there. Sometimes even with cheating, people will say that. You marry a network of people. You marry an individual, but you're also marrying their family and their friends. And those people get really invested in the continuation of your marriage. So even just going public with a breakup is very difficult and painful for both parties, and can be especially difficult on the party who decided to end things if folks don't, think that their reason was, quote, good enough. So when we think back to that discussion of we don't have useful guidelines for acknowledging problems and ending relationships, that's magnified by this involvement of other people in our relationships and their investment in that. And we can certainly see that in what happens in the aftermath of going public. Sometimes people begin a divorce process with a period of separation, a marital separation. And sometimes during that period, those folks will begin dating again. And this can be an important step for folks who are separated or divorced. It's sort of this formal statement to other people that the marriage has in fact ended. So folks who were, kind of holding out hope that somehow that couple was going to work things out, that's sort of a formal marker that, hey, that's not going to happen. It also permits the individual to enhance their self-esteem. Going through a divorce can be, and it typically is, a huge blow to the self-esteem. Even if you initiated it, there can still be this period of I'm X number of years old and I'm alone and I've had this failed marriage. And, it can be a big blow. If you weren't in favor of the divorce, if someone else initiated the divorce and you didn't want it, that can be intensified for you. Now, income plays a big role in moving from the status of being separated to being divorced. Most people who are separated from their spouse reported getting divorced within 3 years of separating. So think about that a second. Sometimes people separate and they're separated for years before they move forward. 15% of people who separated did not get a divorce within the first 10 years because it costs too much. Now, think about that. We've got people who are sort of trapped in limbo in these legal contracts with the state because they cannot afford to move forward with legally disentangling themselves from someone else. And this is especially true when children are involved. So again, when we think back to those divorce stats and you think about me saying like they're not really that useful, see, this is a factor too. Folks who are separated, they're not counted in those divorce stats, but they're not happily married either. So what are the consequences of divorce? We know it's a process. We know that it has a lot of emotional stuff attached and stigma. What are the consequences? The non-economic consequences include, but is not limited to, more psychological distress, lower levels of happiness. Even if it was your idea to get divorced, you're not going to be like happy right away. At least you're not going to be like your baseline typical amount of happy. More social isolation. Sometimes people like divorce is catching, like, oh, they got divorced, and then your friends will kind of shy away from you because they know intellectually they can't catch it, but they feel like maybe they can. More health problems. Some divorced people experience higher levels of personal growth and autonomy. So this list does not apply to everybody, but most people will have some combination of these non-economic consequences. Health problems, for example, your immune system may actually literally be lower just because you're kind of sad over the breakup. But there are those people that experience these higher levels of personal growth and greater autonomy. After divorce, women experience less stress and better adjustment in general than men do. Now, let's think about that for a second. We know that 2/3 of marriages are initiated by women, right? And we know that we know that the divorce rate has dropped in part because of these changing gender roles. Specifically, we have these more egalitarian divisions of labor in the home. That's making women happier. That's dropping the divorce rate. Once a divorce happens, women are having less stress and better adjustment than men do. Now, don't mistake this for like, oh, women get divorced and they're just like having a big party and shaking their groove thing. No, that's not what I'm saying. But compared to men, they're doing better. This is likely because women are more likely to notice, notice marital problems and then feel relief because those problems have ended. Okay. And that makes sense, right? If you're the person in the relationship who's like, hey, things are not the way they should be, and you've tried to work on it and can't get it fixed, and then the problem ends, yeah, obviously you're gonna have less stress and better adjustment. They're also more likely to rely on their social support systems and get help from others. Women tend to have larger social networks in general than men do, and they're better at asking for help than men are. And again, this is not some biological, something inherent to men or to women. This is socialization. Men are socialized not to ask for help, okay, and not to show a lot of emotion. And that very much works against them in the case of divorce. Men get a larger social support system when they get married because they sort of, now have access to their wife's social network. And when they get divorced, now they don't again, okay? Women are also more likely to experience an increase in self-esteem when they divorce and they add new roles to their lives. Okay. So for men, they experience a greater emotional adjustment and they have more adjustment problems than women do. And that includes things like the loss of intimacy. Like I said, men tend to have much smaller social networks, and they tend to not be able to, or not feel like they're able to express their emotions or ask for help. And so the one person they had in their lives that they had this intimacy with, poof, that's gone. They've got a loss of social connection because they've lost that whole. They haven't just lost half of their network; they've lost more than half their network because their wife's social network was larger than theirs. Of course, you have reduced finances, and then commonly you have the interruption of the parental role. So men really struggle with divorce, the consequences of it, much more so than women do. Now, men remarry more often. The happier a man was with being married in general, not necessarily in that specific marriage, but just being married, having a wife, the more likely it is he's going to remarry. And men tend to remarry more quickly than women do once they get divorced. Usually, men are going to be remarried within 3 years. For women, it's nearly 5 years, somewhere around 4.5 years or so. Now, typically, initially, men are much more negative about the divorce, and they devote a lot more energy in attempting to salvage that marriage, because there are many good things in marriage for men. They're getting all that increased intimacy, which, yeah, the wife is too, but she has other social ties that she probably has intimate connections with. Men, not as much. He's got that access to that large social network. She already has a large social network. Both of them are going to experience a reduction in finances. That's absolutely true. But then if you look at the division of labor in the household, it's likely that the woman was doing much more caretaking and inside household chores than men are. So he's losing a lot of stuff that she isn't losing. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying, oh, women should get divorced because marriage is, that's not what I'm saying at all. If you know me, you know that I'm very much a love person. I think love makes the world go round. I think it's like the whole purpose in being here. I'm very married. I'm very familied. I believe in that kind of stuff. I always knew I would have children. I always knew I was going to be married. And I am married. 10 years in July. How about that? I was in captivity 12 years previous to this. So, I'm someone who obviously believes in marriage. But these are the trends and the statistics for how things go. And again, don't mistake what I'm saying to be that, oh, women are just, divorce is no problem at all. No, that's not the case, not whatsoever. This example here, Mark Paul Gosselaar was married, got divorced, and the lady here in the picture on the right, he proposed to her just 3 months after his divorce was final. That's like record time, but not unusual for men to get married pretty quickly thereafter. The suicide risk for men doubles after the divorce. Divorced women are no more likely to commit suicide than single women or married women are. But divorced men are double the rate. And because the suicide rate of men is already doubled from, so just any man, any woman, a man is at a 2 times increased rate risk for suicide. Am I making sense? Hopefully I am. So divorced men are 4 times more likely to end their lives after the breakup of their marriage because they were already double at risk. Divorced men and unmarried men, their mortality rates are up to 250% higher than married men. So yes, marriage is literally good for a man's mental health. The causes for premature death for divorced men include the following. So this is causes of death, like not suicide, just death. Cardiovascular disease, hypertension, stroke, and they're more prone to various diseases from common colds to life-threatening health problems when they're divorced versus being married. And if you think about this for a second, it makes total sense. Okay, so you got the suicide rate thing. Then you've got this health thing, this premature death health thing. So that's not killing yourself. That's just premature death. Cardiovascular disease, hypertension, stroke. Okay, well, this makes sense, right? They're not, they don't have a woman in their home who's monitoring what they're eating and making sure that they're eating healthy. Now, again, am I saying like, oh, men are not capable? No, not at all. But if they spent their married lives with someone else sort of like in charge or responsible for that, they don't have that anymore. Okay. And then just being more prone to various diseases makes sense because their immune system is going to be more compromised because they're unhappy and their whole sort of system is disrupted from this divorce. Divorced men are actually more likely to partake in risky activities, including abusing drugs and alcohol. Depression is much more common in divorced men. In fact, they undergo psychiatric care 10 times more often than married men do. And that's saying a lot because back to those premature death things for divorced men, that's another thing. Married women are often nagging their husbands to go to the doctor because men are resistant to going to the doctor. And again, that has to do with socialization. They've been taught not to complain, to suck it up, be a man, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're divorced, they don't have anyone nagging them to go to the doctor. So the fact that they undergo psychiatric care 10 times more than married men do, that's very significant because married men may, in fact, part of their rates for going to psychiatric care may have to do with their wives nagging them to go. Excuse me. Those who split at a younger age tend to have more health issues than those who divorce later in life. Okay. And that's both genders. So the younger I am when I get a divorce, the more likely I'm going to have health issues than those who divorce later in life. And that's probably because older people tend to have more coping skills to deal with the stress of divorce. Makes sense, right? The longer you live, the more you learn kind of how to cope with things. More so than when you're younger. I know that's definitely true for me. My 20s were just totally insane. And a lot of it was just me, like, I don't know how to cope with life and adulting and all that kind of stuff. So the younger you are when you get a divorce, the worse that's going to be on you, regardless if you're male or female. 50% of divorces involve minor children. And the mythology is that divorce is always bad for children, regardless, no matter what, period. But the reality is, if marital conflict is high, parental divorce may actually increase emotional well being of children. Now, there are many negative effects for children. Economic hardship is highly associated with divorce. But in most cases, children usually adapt to divorce, show a lot of resiliency, and not dysfunction in response to divorce. In kids' adjustment to divorce, that is absolutely impacted by the following things: their custodial parent having good psychological adjustment to the divorce. We know most of the time kids are going to end up with their mothers. We know that women tend to adjust better to divorce than men do. So for children who live with their mothers, that's probably a good thing. Children end up living with their dads or have joint custody, and dad's having a much harder time with that divorce. Obviously, that's going to impact the kid as well. Another point about men and their adjustment to divorce. Again, please be sure that you understand I'm not implying that there's some inherent deficiency with men that causes them to have this effect. This is largely socialization, including the socialization for women to be caretakers and to manage the emotional lives of everyone in their household, including their husbands. Okay, so kids' adjustment to divorce depends on good psychological adjustment to divorce by custodial parent, having a stable living situation, and the parent they're living with having good parenting skills. Well, think about it. That's going to be true for kids whose parents are married, right? That's the same in both situations. And continued involvement with the children by both parents. So kids are going to do okay in a divorce if their custodial parent has adjusted well to the divorce, they have a stable living situation, their parents have good parenting skills, and both parents continue to be involved with the child. Children of divorce suffer a reduction of income. There's a 21% reduction on average in family income if they live with their mom. They often suffer weakening ties with their fathers, a loss of residential stability, either because the custodial parent's having to move around more because of money issues or having to flop from house to house. Often they suffer problems in school, greater likelihood of becoming teen parents. So there are some adjustment issues. However, a 2003 study by Amato found 90% of children with divorced parents actually achieve the same well-being as children of continuously married couples. So in other words, there may be this period where things are not awesome, but then most of them are going to rally and end up being just as well adjusted as kids that didn't end up having a divorce. And you may recognize this picture here because it went viral. This is one of the big predictors of how children do with divorce. When we have involved parents who continue being involved past the divorce, who co-parent with one another in a healthy, functional manner. And that's what this picture represents, right? You've got mom and dad who clearly moved on and married other folks, and those folks are invested in this little girl's life as well. They're all at the same game together and standing on the sidelines together. So obviously, we don't have just a ton of acrimony, or if we do, we're just holding it together for the kid, which is to the benefit of the child. All right, let's talk more about children and divorce. The parental loss perspective assumes a household with two parents always trumps a single parent household. This perspective is founded on the idea that both parents are crucial sources of guidance, support, assistance, supervision. And it's also predicated on the idea that kids anticipate a home with two parents. So it's assumed that children suffer from a lack of contact with the absent parent. Divorce is a highly stressful process, and it decreases a parent's ability to parent, at least for a while. During the first year after divorce, custodial moms tend to be more anxious, depressed, and angry than married mothers. That usually tends to dissipate over time, but that first year is a very big adjustment. Child custody is generally based on one of two standards: the best interests of the child and the least detrimental of the available alternatives. One type of child custody is sole custody. This actually accounts for 85% of all U.S. divorce cases. Women traditionally have been responsible for child rearing, and in this particular society, men don't always feel competent to do so, even though we know from research they absolutely are competent, but many do not feel confident. Father-only families are growing rapidly. From 1980 to 1988 alone, the number of father-headed families tripled. Currently, 19% of all single-parent families are headed by fathers, and 4% of all children live in single-father families. Many families also have joint custody. This accounts for about 10% of cases. Joint legal custody means that children live primarily with one parent, but both parents share in decisions regarding the children. Joint physical custody requires parents to work out practical logistics as well as their feelings about each other. So you've got joint custody can mean joint legal custody, where kids live with one parent. Let's say they live with mom, but both mom and dad share equally in all decisions. Joint physical custody means kid lives with mom and dad and shuttles between houses. And that requires a lot more logistics, obviously, than just joint legal custody. Split custody. This splits children between parents. This is a not very common arrangement. Usually it's a situation where the girls live with the mother and the boys live with the father, but not always. Many states don't even recognize this as a valid custody situation, if you will. But some couples still do it, even if the state doesn't recognize it. And some couples may move from one custody type to the other. So they may start out with like sole custody, move to joint, start out with sole, move to split, et cetera, as children age and go through different phases of their lives. One situation may make sense at one point in their life, and then later another situation may make more sense. The ideal after divorce would be co-parenting, okay? But most families end up practicing parallel parenting, meaning that at least after several years, like they may start out trying to co-parent, but then after several years, parents will end up going about parenting separately. So kids have one set of rules at one house and one set of rules at another house, and they're just sort of, parenting while the child is with them. And then when the kid's with the other parent, the other parent's doing what they're doing, which is not the same thing at all as co-parenting. But many couples cannot make co-parenting work. It makes sense. If they could get along, well enough to do that kind of stuff, they might have been able to stay married. So it's kind of not really surprising that that doesn't work for a lot of families. Most court-ordered child support is paid by fathers, and nearly half of all men neither see their children nor financially support their children. Some say that these visits to their children are a painful reminder of a failed marriage. Sometimes it's that fathers are investing in a new family if they remarry. The parent is most likely to receive full child support payments if they have at least a college degree, if they're legally divorced, rather than a breakup outside of a marriage. So, you were never married, you had a kid, okay, you're going to be less likely to get child support payments. And if the non-custodial parent has current contact with the children and is over 40 years old. Despite our high divorce rate, we also have the highest remarriage rate. We like weddings in the United States. We like to get married. We like to be married. 1 in 5 of us have married 2 or more times. By 10 years after a divorce, 75% of folks are remarried. So if someone gets a divorce within a decade, they're usually remarried. We tend to marry homophilously, Homophyly, homophily, meaning we like with like, okay? And we tend to do that the first time, right? We tend to marry folks who are similar age, similar education, racial background, etc. When we remarry, we tend to remarry homophilously, meaning people who've never been married tend to marry people who've never been married, and divorced folks tend to marry folks who've also been divorced. The average age of the first remarriage in the United States is 33 for women and 35 for men. The marriage rates are higher for both sexes who are 50 years and older, but higher, even higher for men in that age group. Half of all remarriages begin with cohabitation, and this may be testing the relationship. Living together after the divorce is more common than living together before the first marriage. In other words, if I've gotten divorced and then I find myself in a new relationship that seems like it's going serious, maybe that person wants to get married, I'm going to be more likely to say, hey, let's move in, let's try it out before we legally commit ourselves to one another. But not all living together after divorce ends in remarriage. So you have relationships that folks are divorced, they meet someone new, they move in, they test it out, they decide this isn't working, it doesn't make it to the altar. Characteristics of remarried couples. Caucasians have the highest remarriage rate, and that's especially true for white women. In 2004, 19% of Caucasian women married 2 or more times, 11% of African American women, 9% of Latinas, and 6% of Asian women. Non-white women from communities with high unemployment and poverty have a reduced likelihood of remarriage, just like they have a reduced likelihood of first marriage. Social class plays a role as well. The wealthier a divorced man is, the more likely he is to remarry. Men with higher educational attainment are more likely to remarry than women are with similar education. So in other words, if I'm a man, I have higher educational attainment, I'm more likely to remarry. If I'm a woman with higher educational attainment, I'm not as likely. Women who have a higher socioeconomic level may not be willing to remarry because they have less to gain from it. Okay, I have this higher level of education. I can support myself more easily. So, what am I getting out of this next relationship? I don't need someone to support me financially. So my impetus to remarry may be lower. Additionally, they may have a larger pool of candidates from which to choose because of that. However, some other studies suggest it may work the opposite way. There have been studies that show the higher level of education a woman has, the less likely she is to marry at all, because it's more difficult for her to find an equal partner, because very often men with the same level of education as her tend to marry women with less education. More than 60% of second marriages fail. The average length of a second marriage is 10.8 years for a man and 7 years for a woman. 70% of third marriages fail. So 60% of second marriages fail, 70% of third marriages fail. The average duration of a third marriage is 4.9 years for women and 5.1 years for men. So what does this mean? So some people have extrapolated that, oh, these second marriages just don't work, third marriages just don't work. I mean, we could look at it that way, but what we know is if someone is the kind of person who is willing to go ahead with a divorce, right? And there's lots of people who don't, right? There's lots of people who live in marriages and just are unhappy and they're just not willing to take that step because of the stigma, loss of finances, social ties, et cetera, et cetera. If someone was willing to do that the first time, they've demonstrated they're not willing to settle. So if they weren't willing to settle in the first marriage, they're going to be even less likely to settle in a second or third marriage because they've already demonstrated their willingness to go ahead and step out and leave a marriage that isn't working. Okay. So it has more to do with the kind of people who divorce and remarry than it does anything specific to remarriages. Okay. Divorced people are less fearful of divorce than people who've never been divorced before. Okay. And like I just said, they're unwilling to stay in an unhappy marriage because they've already exited a marriage to begin with. Now, after 15 years together, people in a second or third marriage would be less likely to divorce than someone in their first marriage. Okay, so does that make sense? Let me walk that through. So if I've gotten divorced and I'm in my second marriage, I'm going to be more likely to leave because I've already done it once. If I'm in my third marriage, I'm going to be even more likely to leave because I've already done that twice. But if I'm in a remarriage and I've been in that next marriage, not the first, for 15 years, I'm now less likely to divorce than someone who's in their first marriage. Okay. Remember, there's something magical about that 15-year thing. I told you we have a lot of research, that sort of ends at 15 years because you just assume people are going to stay together. For whatever reason, if a couple stays together for 15 years, their likelihood of divorcing plummets significantly. Okay. The theory is, why is this the case? That if I'm in the second marriage, third marriage, whatever, I've been 15 years, I'm less likely. Why? Because I'm staying married because I want to be married, not out of fear. I've already left a marriage, right? I've already divorced. So I'm not staying in this marriage because I'm afraid of getting divorced because I've already done that. So I'm staying because I want to be there. Also, I'm probably more skilled in working out the nuances of shared life. Right? Think about it. The more you do something, the better you get at it, right? So it's just sort of the same idea of folks who get married early are more likely to divorce, right? Because they've had less time to sort of sort out what is it I really want in a partner? Who am I? What do I need out of a relationship, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I've been married for 15 years with somebody. I'm going to be better at working stuff out between the two of us than I was before. Functional and stable remarriages are actually more proud of having stayed together and the fact that they're married and functional and happy, and report higher satisfaction than couples in first marriages. Okay. So think about that for a second. If I'm in my first marriage and my marriage is functional or stable, I mean, I'm happy about it, whatever, and I'm satisfied. But if I'm in a remarriage that's functional and stable, I'm even more satisfied and I'm more proud about that, right? And that makes sense too, right? Because in the back of your mind, you may be thinking, hey, my first marriage didn't work out because there's something flawed within me. Well, I'm in this remarriage that proves that's not necessarily the case. So it kind of makes sense if you think about it. People who have divorced and remarried multiple times tend to be relatively nonconformist. I don't think that is a big shock. Also, folks who get divorced and decide to remarry, they tend to be very optimistic. Why? Well, they're optimistic because they're not seeing themselves as responsible for the previous marriage ending. They're more likely to believe that their partner's behavior caused the divorce and more likely to minimize the influence of their own actions. And they're optimistic that a new partnership will lead to better results. So think about that for a second. If I get divorced and I'm realistic about my own contribution to that divorce, I'm less optimistic that in a subsequent relationship, I'm going to be able to figure out how to make that work better. But if I don't think I'm responsible, if I think, I divorced because that person was just a jackhole, or they just did all this terrible stuff or they were impossible or whatever it was, then I don't see that the problem has anything to do with me and I just had the wrong partner. So in that situation, I'm going to be much more likely to want to remarry, because under that paradigm, all I really need is the right partner, and I'm going to be able to work this out successfully. That makes sense. Challenges to the remarrying couple. There are 5 major structural challenges to the couple who's getting remarried. First is unrealistic expectations, and that's a structural challenge to those getting married the first time as well. Children's loyalty binds. If I had kids from one marriage and now I'm in a second marriage or a third marriage, my kids um, may struggle with which parent they want to be loyal to, or feeling like maybe they owe some loyalty to the other parent. A breakdown of parenting tasks, the uniting of disparate family cultures. And then, of course, you're trying to juggle the exes in the middle of all this. And that brings us to blended families. Let's talk about those for a little bit. Remarriages involving stepchildren have a greater rate of dissolution than those that do not. And that makes sense. It's going to be harder to work out that relationship if there is a child involved than if there isn't, because just more people to try to work things out with. But having children is also associated with higher rates of remarriage. So if I have children, I'm more likely to remarry, but that remarriage is also more likely to not work out. Gay and lesbian step families, they're similar to traditional step families and may encounter many of the same problems. And on top of that, they may encounter a lot of stigmatization that traditional step families do not. Some of the characteristics of step families. Integration typically takes years rather than months. People sort of expect these families to come together very quickly, but in reality, it takes years. They often don't function like a family by the end of the 3rd year. So it takes more than 3 years for them to sort of work out how to be a family together. Important relationships may be cut off or end abruptly, and others may spring up overnight. There are continuous transitions and adjustments rather than stability. And there's multiple relationships to work out. You've got the step parents working things out, the step parent and step children, the mother and children working on a new relationship. Everyone in the step family has experienced some loss. 70% of children with divorced parents are living without their biological father, and many are still wishing that he'd reappear. Spouses have undergone previous loss. This is especially true if both have divorced in the past. There may have been some relocating away from family and friends, loved ones. Everyone is connected psychologically to someone outside the unit. So we have a situation we call ghosts at the table. So there may be a lot of playing on emotions, love, loyalty, guilt, fear. And this can have the power to tear a new marriage and family apart. The bond between the parent and the biological children predates the relationship between the parent and the new spouse. It also predates the relationship between the step parent and the stepchild. So this short history that they have, this short shared history they have, can create conflicts and can create feelings of disloyalty to the biological parent if they end up having a good relationship with their step parent. There's sort of a stepism, a stigma, this assumption that step families are inferior to biological families. Another strain on the relationship is that there's no child-free period for the spouses. There's no honeymoon where it's just them trying to work out the new dynamics of the relationship. The most consistent findings on step families show outcomes for children greatly depend on their relationships with children, parents, and step parents in the household. Close relationships with step parents, non-custodial fathers, non-custodial mothers are all associated with better outcomes. Children benefit the most when the adults in all of the relationships in their lives get along. So when all the adults in their lives get along, children benefit the most. We do have what we call a Cinderella effect. Step parents display fewer positive behaviors toward stepchildren than they do toward genetic children. On average, there is less investment in education. They spend less time playing with their stepchildren. They take their stepchildren to the doctor less. 30 years of data shows that there's a wealth of evidence indicating a direct relationship between step-parent relationships and abuse. Child abuse and homicide, there's a relationship there as well. There's a greatly elevated risk of child maltreatment, including lethal beatings, not just including, especially lethal beatings. Non-biologically related parents are up to 100 times more likely to kill their child than a biological parent is. Children under the age of 18 account for 2.9% of all homicides in which a relationship between the victim and the offender was known. Children under the age of 5 years old are roughly 8 times more likely to be killed by a stepfather than by a genetic father, and 3 times more likely to be killed by a stepmom than their genetic mother. Let's discuss those who are unhappily married but staying married. Study of unhappy marriages over a 12-year period showed that those who stay report the following: lower life satisfaction, lower self-esteem, lower overall health, all of that compared to those who are divorced. So people who stay in unhappy marriages are subject to lower life satisfaction, lower self-esteem, lower overall health than those who went ahead and got divorced. And this is whether or not those that got divorced got remarried. Conversely, a 2006 study found that the psychological functioning and happiness of spouses improves after the divorce. So, excuse me, the couples in that study, divorce was actually good for them. So in some cases, divorce can be a positive thing if there was a lot of conflict in the marriage, a lot of low self-esteem, low levels of satisfaction, etc. So staying unhappily married is actually worse for you than going ahead and getting divorced. Happy marriages make us very happy and improve our overall outlook, life satisfaction, happiness, self-esteem. Unhappy marriages greatly threaten our mental health and our physical health. The bottom line is divorce is not the worst thing that can happen in all scenarios. In some situations, divorce is actually the best outcome. But there are a lot of effects of divorce, both emotional and financial, and remarriage always isn't always a fix-it. Blended families have their own challenges. However, there are those families who are outliers